All right, welcome to chapter 25, dealing with the Second World War and at least the immediate after effects of it, and what we learned from it. This is going to be split up, I think, into three rather unequal lectures. The first one is going to deal with the situation of the world and then how America is reacting to that situation. And then it'll end with the events of Pearl Harbor, which actually gets America into the war. But most of this is going to be, this first lecture is going to be about how America is attempting to avoid getting into the war. The second lecture is going to deal with American mobilization, the actual fighting of the war, sort of very briefly, and then some ways in which it has affected Americans. Apart from actively trying to improve relations with Latin America, for the most part, the early administration of Franklin Roosevelt was pretty disinterested in world politics and attempted to remain somewhat aloof with regards to world politics. In Latin America, we did attempt to extend something of an internationalist approach that was practiced by Roosevelt's predecessor with regards to relations in Latin America. There was some existing bitterness between Latin American countries and the United States over what they saw as imperialism. And so Roosevelt was attempting to ease that relationship and declared what became known as the good neighbor policy, which is essentially renouncing the right of any nation to intervene in the affairs of another. And in order to sort of show that he meant this on good faith, he removed the troops from Haiti and the Dominican Republic, where they had been stationed for a number of years, and terminated the Platt Amendment, which gave the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuba, should we see a need to do so. However, even though we weren't actively intervening, sort of militarily, we weren't putting soldiers into Latin American countries, economic intervention still was a large part of how the U.S. dealt with Latin American countries. And so in that way, the good neighbor policy was more of a facade, I suppose, than anything else. Or as Captain Barbosa would say in the Pirates of the Caribbean, more guidelines than actual rules. In Cuba, for example, in 1933, you have a rather leftist regime coming into power, and instead of sending in the Marines, which we might have done in previous periods, the U.S. provided indirect aid to a conservative revolution. And it was led by the Batista, and when that revolution eventually overthrew the leftist government, American economic assistance would allow them to retain power until they were again overthrown by Fidel Castro and his revolutionary forces in 1959. Despite the rather loose definition, I suppose, of good neighbor, it did serve to improve relations between the U.S. and Latin America to some extent, and it would help to achieve some form of hemispheric solidarity for when the U.S. does actually have to get into the Second World War. And also, once we get involved in the Cold War, even though relations become much more intense during the Cold War because you do have a lot of efforts to install communist regimes and some even successful installations of communist regimes in Latin America, which kind of adds tension, but that is a different lecture. Meanwhile, sort of while we're doing this in Latin America, you see sort of powerful forces raging in other parts of the world. As early as 1922, economic and social unrest in Italy enabled Benito Mussolini to seize power, and he remained as dictator in Italy until 1943. He was sort of ruthless at suppressing dissent. He imposed a one-party fascist rule, adopted anti-Semitic laws, and had some intentions of recreating a Roman Empire, and to that end decided to invade Ethiopia in 1935. Also, as far as strong arm tactics from European countries, you have the rise of the National Socialist Party, or the Nazi Party, in Germany, led by Adolf Hitler. He started gaining very broad support, largely as a direct result of the Depression, which was as a direct result of the rather harsh measures imposed on Germany by the Versailles Treaty. There was some fear of communism added into that resentment of the treaty, which enabled him to seize power. He was able to essentially sell a message that German people found very agreeable, and it was very nationalistic and patriotic of a message. And so, at a time when arguably people were ashamed to be German, it instilled some form of national pride, and so he was able to gather quite an impressive following. He was elected chancellor in 1933 and imposed a rather brutal dictatorship following that. He began his own pursuit of world domination, which he had described in a publication that he released in 1923, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. He also instituted a program to purify the fatherland of Jews, who he had sort of landed on as the perfect scapegoat for the reason that Germany was defeated in the First World War. And most people like having some kind of scapegoat, and so they were quite happy to go along with it, unless, of course, you were Jewish. Hitler began rearming Germany in 1935, contrary to the Versailles Treaty, and a year later, German troops moved in to reoccupy the Rhineland. The Rhineland is a region that is within Germany, but it's right along the border with France. And it was specifically disarmed by the Versailles Treaty, and so again flouting the treaty to move troops back into that area. In 1938, as German tanks began rolling into Vienna, Hitler proclaimed an Anschluss, or a union, between Austria and Germany. It all happened fairly peacefully. And while other Western leaders in London and Paris, as well as in Washington, all disapproved of the move, the Anschluss, none of them wanted to take any kind of aggressive action against that, because all of them still very fresh in their minds, the horrors of the First World War. And so fear of that kind of war, again, really motivates a lot of these early policies that are basically hoping to meet Germany's demands in the rather vain hope that they will be happy with it and then just sort of stay, a policy which becomes known as appeasement. This is kind of exemplified in the claim that the Nazis had over at least one area of the Czech Republic, the Sudetenland, which was home to a lot of ethnic Germans, and it was part of Czechoslovakia. They insisted that the territory belonged to Germany, and quite famously, Neville Chamberlain and his French counterpart, Neville Chamberlain was the Prime Minister of Britain, they agreed to allow Hitler to take the Sudetenland, largely out of fear of another world war. In return for allowing that, they got assurances from Hitler that Germany had no further territorial ambitions, and they quite famously have a picture of Chamberlain shaking hands with Hitler, and it was done at a conference in Munich in 1938. And they're hoping that would be the end of it. Something of a vain hope, and Chamberlain often gets widely criticized by contemporary historians, or rather modern historians, although at the time I imagine his contemporaries appreciated his efforts to keep them out of a war. On the other side of the world, in the meantime, Japan and their militarists are gaining control of the government, and they launch a rather fateful course of expansion, sending troops into northern China into the province of Manchuria in 1931 and initiating a full-scale war against China later in 1937, they managed to expand and gain control over key areas of China as well as other places in the Pacific. So you have similar territorial ambitions from the Japanese. America's rather feeble response to these actions going on all around the world are a reflection of the people's belief that the decision to go to war in 1917 was largely a mistake. And this kind of conviction was rooted in America's very deep and abiding isolationist tradition. The idea that we should avoid military or political entanglements in old world quarrels, as well as something of our desire to have our government focus on the Depression and its domestic effects rather than being embroiled in petty quarrels overseas. In 1934 through 1936 even, there was a Senate investigation which found that it was war profiteers, later nicknamed merchants of death, who had tricked the United States into war for financial gain. And a poll taken in January of 1937 showed that 70% of American people believed that the United States should have stayed out of the First World War in 1917. So a sentiment turning largely against it. And if you recall from when we looked at those magazines from the 1930s, 1938, 1939, when all of this is kicking off in Europe, you have the Munich Accords going down in 1938, you have the actual start of the First World War in 1939, and indications of it early in 1939, and it's noticeably absent from those 1930s magazines that we looked at. And so that reflects the idea that Americans really just wanted to stay out of it. By the mid-1930s, an overwhelming majority of Americans thought that the mistake of intervention should not be repeated again. And in order to make this a much more sort of permanent type policy, in between 1935 and 1937, a series of neutrality acts are passed in Congress, which echoes this kind of longing for peace, or at the very least, a longing to leave us out of it. These laws outlawed things like arms sales or loans to nations at war. It forbade Americans to travel on ships of belligerent powers, all things that tied us to the war effort in the First World War were essentially forbidden by law so that we would be able to more effectively stay out of it in the Second World War. So in the 1930s, any American confrontation with fascism only took place sort of symbolically in the sports arena, most famously the 1936 Olympics, which took place in Berlin. African-American track star Jesse Owens made a mockery of Nazi theories that racial sort of Aryan supremacy, the idea that white native Germans were racially superior to anyone else, by winning 4 gold medals in that year. And although the story is far more complex as far as really looking at the dynamics at play. But as we move into the later years, 1938, 1939, it's becoming more and more difficult for Americans to ignore what's going on the other side of the world. On March 15th of 1939, Nazi troops overran the rest of Czechoslovakia, rolling up Wenceslas Square. And in fact, I have a picture, which I didn't include on this slide because it's honestly just come to me now, of a building, the Old Town Hall in Prague, which is the only building in Prague that actually sustained any damage during the Second World War. The Czechs had it in their heads to resist the Nazis moving in initially, and then that building was destroyed, and it was decided that rather than risk all of their other cultural heritage, they would just kind of give in. And you can see the place where the building was destroyed, the walls kind of jagged, and you can tell there was another building attached to it, but it's gone now because it was destroyed. So that was the takeover of Czechoslovakia. This was a violation of the Munich Accords, which had been agreed barely a year earlier. 5 months after that step taken against Czechoslovakia, Hitler and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin reach a decision, which is basically that they would not go to war with each other. It was known as the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, and was essentially a very obvious sort of shoring up of his eastern border as far as Hitler was concerned, and should have been a fairly obvious indication that something big was happening. And in fact, something big did happen just a little while later. On September 1st, 1939, German troops roll into Poland and effect a military takeover of that country. And as expected, the response to this was the declaration of war from Britain and France. And so we have yet another global conflict, or what will become a global conflict, kicking off. Isolationist sentiment in America, however, still remained pretty strong, but opinion was beginning to shift at this point. After the fall of Czechoslovakia, Roosevelt called for action short of war in order to check the expansion of fascism. He also sent messages asking Hitler and Mussolini to pledge no further aggression. However, they didn't take those messages very well. And some of them, I believe, it was Mussolini who even made jokes about the president's disability, saying that the paralysis must have reached his brain. This wasn't Roosevelt's only move. He didn't just send the messages. In October of 1938, he asked Congress for a $300 million military appropriation. And in November, he instructed the Army Air Corps to plan for an annual production of 20,000 airplanes, preparing the U.S. for what would, he saw at that point, probably be eventual participation in this conflict. In January of 1939, he also submitted a defense budget, which was around $1.3 billion worth. Hitler and the Nazis had sort of translated their hatred of the Jews as the reason for Germany's defeat in the First World War into an official policy with the passage of the Nuremberg Laws in 1935, which stripped Jewish citizens the right of German citizenship. It increased restrictions on them with regards to education, social restrictions, economic restrictions, even restrictions of their movement. They were sort of bound to ghettos and places like that, and couldn't move outside of them. The crescendo came in early November in 1938, when you have what became known as Kristallnacht, or Night of the Broken Glass. Sorry, my German pronunciation is probably atrocious. This was essentially a frenzy of rioting and looting, arson, destruction, all against Jewish citizens in Germany. The Jews who had been leaving Germany since early in the 1930s. Almost as soon as Hitler came to power, the Jews began leaving Germany, and they were coming by the hundreds of thousands. Between 1933 and 1938, 60,000 of them fled to the United States. However, sort of continuing our isolationist sentiment and the general anti-Semitism, which actually ruled a lot of American thinking, most Americans didn't favor extending the quotas or anything like that in order to admit more refugees. Congress rejected all efforts to liberalize immigration laws, and Roosevelt did very little to translate his sympathy for their plight into any kind of effective policy as well. And so, actually, America took very few Jewish refugees in, but some of the Jewish refugees we did take in ended up being very important to our war effort as it existed. The picture here, you can see Albert Einstein taking an oath, probably an oath of citizenship, actually, and or some other form of loyalty oath. I couldn't tell you exactly what he's swearing to, But he, of course, becomes very important to our war effort as he's one of the lead scientists working on the Manhattan Project, which we'll discuss later. And he's actually the one that warns the U.S. government that Germany is attempting to make atomic weaponry, and actually is the sort of boost that we need to consider starting the Manhattan Project. So these refugees actually play an important role in American war effort later on. So following Germany's early and rather decisive and quick victories in Western Europe, Roosevelt's policy of neutrality gives way to a policy of economic intervention, and eventually it becomes actual war whenever we are physically attacked. The war in Europe began officially on September 1st when Nazi armies poured into Poland, and the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force, unleashed devastation on Polish cities. It was an extremely effective invasion, to say the least. Although Roosevelt invoked the Neutrality Acts, he refused to ask Americans to be impartial in thought and deed in the way that Wilson had done at the start or the outbreak of the First World War. Tailoring his actions to the public mood, which favored both preventing Nazi victory and staying out of the war, Roosevelt persuaded Congress to amend the Neutrality Acts to allow belligerents to purchase weapons from the United States if they paid on a cash and carry basis, meaning they paid cash for the goods and then carried them off on their own ships. Shortly after this, in the spring of 1940, Hitler unleashed his Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, against Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg. And his sort of war machine sweeps its way all the way to the English Channel in barely 2 months. Early in June, the British are feeling the pressure so badly that most of their forces evacuated rather quickly and heroically at Dunkirk. And on June 22nd, France officially surrenders to the Nazi army and becomes an occupied territory pretty much for the rest of the war. Hitler then takes direct aim at Great Britain by bombing British cities, sort of continuously bombing British cities. This, as it becomes known, the Battle of Britain. Britain is devastating, really, to the British. Prime Minister Winston Churchill pleads with America for aid, and a lot of Americans favored using such aid, largely because they were shocked at the willingness of the Germans to launch these attacks directly against British citizens and not sort of military installations. There was, however, still a large minority who opposed any kind of aid, direct aid to the British, as they saw it as wasteful, that these materials needed to be used to protect the United States. In 1940, news of the Battle of Britain competes with speculation as to whether Roosevelt will run for an unprecedented third term in office as well. And so American attention is kind of divided at the time. The threat from Germany and her allies pretty much made Roosevelt's renomination a foregone conclusion, basically. It also led the Republicans to nominate Wendell Willkie as their candidate. He was an absolute internationalist who actually championed greater aid to Great Britain. Roosevelt, in his campaign for his third term in office, was pretty hands-off. He sort of played the role of national leader who was too busy with defense and diplomacy to engage in sort of petty partisan politics. And he even appointed sort of bipartisan members of his cabinet. For example, he appointed the Republicans Harry Stimson and Frank Knox as the Secretary of War and Secretary of the Navy in his otherwise sort of Democratic cabinet, rather. He also signed the Select Service and Training Act, which became the first peacetime draft in U.S. history, and approved a dramatic increase in defense funding. Later in September, he also engineered a kind of swap with England, a destroyers for bases swap, where we essentially traded 50 of our older warships with England for British air and naval bases that they still had in the Western Hemisphere. These kind of moves infuriated those who still were very strongly isolationist, most notably a group calling themselves the America First Committee, who insisted that America could stand alone if attacked by the Axis. However, a majority of Americans, 55%, voted Roosevelt into office for a third term, which indicated general approval, at least, of the way he was handling the crisis. Now that he's secure for another 4 years, Roosevelt calls on the United States to become the arsenal of democracy and proposes a new program for aiding the Allied forces. It's called the Lend-Lease program, and this would allow the U.S. to lend or lease war materials to any nation deemed vital to America's security. So if helping to defend that nation would keep the Axis away from our front door, basically, or back door even, then it's something that we should undertake in the name of our own defense, basically. Congress approved the Lend-Lease in March of 1941 and approved it for Great Britain, most especially, whenever Hitler turned his attentions on actually attacking the Soviet Union, going against the Non-Aggression Pact that he had signed earlier. The same program is extended to Stalin and the Soviets, as they're now deemed to be important to the actual defense of the American homeland. In mid-1941, Congress also authorized the U.S. Navy to convoy British ships in order to get them safely to the ports, and they had orders to destroy enemy ships if it was necessary. In August, Roosevelt met personally with Churchill aboard a warship, and there they issued a statement known as the Atlantic Charter. This condemned any aggression and affirmed national self-determination, also endorsed the principles of collective security, free trade, and various things like that. A German submarine fired on an American destroyer in September, and following that, Roosevelt authorized naval patrols to shoot on sight any Axis vessels. So we're going further and further into actual warlike activities, even though war has not been officially declared. Largely, America was unprepared for war when we do ultimately get into it, but we were, in this period, fighting a limited war, and a full-scale war seemed to be imminent. I think very few Americans believed that we could still remain out of the fighting at this point. Hitler's success in Western Europe also encouraged Japan to further expand in Asia. Roosevelt tried to apply pressure in order to deter the Japanese from this sort of course without actually provoking them into war before the U.S. was ready to confront such a threat, before they had built what Roosevelt described as a two-ocean navy. The Japanese also hoped to avoid war, but they refused to compromise on their desire to create the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, as they called it, essentially Japanese dominion over at least a majority of East Asia. Japan never really saw the United States as blocking its legitimate rise to power, while Americans viewed Japan's talk of national aspirations as a sort of smokescreen to conceal a more dangerous aggression. Propaganda in both countries sort of hardened positions on both sides, in the U.S. towards the Japanese, And even people who were isolationists with regard to the fighting in Europe were usually interventionist with regards to Japanese aggression in Asia, which goes to show how effective that propaganda was. In 1940, sort of believing that economic coercion would work to get the Japanese out of China, the U.S. ended a trade treaty that had a fairly long standing with Japan. They also banned the sale of aviation fuel and other scrap metal to the Japanese, but the Japanese didn't respond the way we wanted to. They essentially saw it as a challenge, and instead of backing down, they moved into occupied northern Indochina, or Vietnam, as we would call it now. They also moved towards signing the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, creating the Axis powers that we all sort of know from history. The Japanese then moved to overrun the rest of Indochina in 1941. Roosevelt responded by freezing all Japanese assets in the United States and put in a total embargo on trade with Japan. And so at this point, the Japanese had two choices. They could either submit to the United States and regain what they'd lost through this embargo, or they could just move in and conquer new lands in order to get the resources that had been taken away. And they decided on the latter. A rather expansionist war minister came into power in Japan as the prime minister, and he set the first week in December as a deadline for a preemptive strike against the United States. This is all happening round about the summer of 1941. By late November, U.S. intelligence alerted Roosevelt and his administration that some kind of attack was imminent. Negotiations were underway in Washington between the U.S. and the Japanese, but they weren't really making any progress. And so warnings went out to all commanders in the Pacific, advising that some attack from Japan was imminent. Officials generally believed that the Japanese would strike at British or Dutch possessions in East Asia, or even maybe in the Philippines. There was some acknowledgement that perhaps Hawaii was a possible target, but there wasn't any real belief that the Japanese would actually go so far as to attack Hawaii so close to us. Hoping to destroy the entire U.S. Pacific fleet in sort of one go, as they were all sort of moored in Pearl Harbor. The idea was that it would incapacitate the U.S. enough that, being as we were so preoccupied with Hitler in Germany, we would seek some kind of accommodation with Japan instead of actually fighting. And so on the morning of December 7th, 1941, waves of dive bombers and torpedo planes all thundered across the island of Oahu, bombing ships at anchor in Pearl Harbor, destroying planes parked in nearby air bases, and in less than 3 hours, 8 battleships, 3 light cruisers, and 2 destroyers had been sunk or otherwise incapacitated. 360 aircraft were destroyed or damaged, and more than 2,400 Americans were killed. Americans had greatly underestimated the sort of resourcefulness and the daringness of the Japanese. Japanese leaders also erred because they were counting on paralyzing the United States fleet with the attack on Pearl Harbor, and that proved to be a miscalculation. And all it really served to do was to arouse a united nation against Japan. And we still had the capacity to fight back at that point too. So it was definitely a misstep on the part of the Japanese there. On December 8th, Roosevelt gave a speech in Congress, which you all got the opportunity to listen to in class on Tuesday, asking Congress to declare war on Japan, which they did. Hitler then, honoring his pact with the Japanese, declared war on the United States, and Mussolini followed suit. Congress reciprocated. We declared war on them, respectively. And so now we are fully embroiled in the World War. After Pearl Harbor, U-boats began wreaking havoc in the North Atlantic, prowling the Caribbean and even the east coast of the United States, looking for prey. By the end of 1942, the U-boats had destroyed more than 1,000 Allied ships in the North Atlantic. War news from Europe and Africa was pretty much all bad, as Roosevelt admitted, and it seemed as if the Mediterranean would become an Axis sea. Hitler would soon be in India and be able to meet up with the Japanese, essentially marching across Asia, before the U.S. was even really ready to meet them on the battlefield at all. The Japanese had inflicted very heavy defeats on Allied Pacific forces. They controlled the islands of Guam, Wake Island. They controlled Hong Kong, Singapore, the Netherlands, East Indies. American forces in the Philippines were besieged and eventually had to surrender in May of 1942. So everything is looking pretty bleak as America gets into the war. And while we were fighting a limited war, we still are not at full fighting capacity. And so there's still a considerable amount of mobilization that needs to be done in order to fully prepare America for this challenge.